Missouri Department of Conservation made the decision to switch to voluntary testing for chronic wasting disease during opening weekend. Francis Skalicki with MDC joins us now to talk about that decision. Francis, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here, Sarah. Happy we could talk about this because we need to get word out about this.
Absolutely. So, Francis, just starting out, can you explain what chronic wasting disease is and what the purpose is behind, the past mandatory deer sampling for CWD?
Okay, in a nutshell, chronic wasting disease, or CWD as we call it for short, is a disease of the nervous system, or it's a brain wasting disease of cervid animals. So that's deer, moose, all animals in the cervid family. And it's nearly always fatal. It's infectious, which means it's spread from deer to deer. So we've been tracking this for several years. We don't want it to get established here in the state. We do have it, but we feel we're ahead of the game and we want to stay that way. So testing is one way to identify where it is early on, and we can take appropriate steps when we find a positive in that area.
Absolutely. So this is kind of like contact tracing for deer. Is this mostly to identify areas in Missouri that are having an outbreak? Should hunters avoid eating meat of a deer that tests positive?
Well, even though there's been no evidence that humans could get CWD, the Centers for Disease Control has advised that humans don't eat venison that has tested positive for CWD, which is right along the line with what we've always said. We be the Missouri Department of Conservation. We've never said that people should eat sick animals. We've always advised against that. So yeah, from that standpoint, hunters, if they have their deer tested, they should wait until they get a positive, or until they get information back, which in your deer regulations book, which I'll hold up real quickly, this right here, which is free at any place that sells hunting permits, you can get that. In that explains all the procedure, how you have deer tested, how you can check for information. But anyway, so yes, you should wait till you get results back to see whether your deer was tested negative or positive. As far as contact tracing, yes, it's a way to identify if we've had it in Missouri or where we have it in Missouri. As I've said, we do have it in some spots in Missouri. We've tested about 137,000 deer since it was first discovered in 2012 in Missouri. In all that testing, we found 167 positives. So while it is here, it's here in a very small prevalence, and we'd like to keep it that way.
So why is opening weekend usually the best weekend for mandatory testing?
Okay. Opening weekend is always the best time for mandatory testing, which this year will be voluntary, and we'll get to that in a minute. But just because that is the time when the most deer are harvested. Studies have shown that about 1/3 of all the deer that are harvested in Missouri for all the hunting season, that's bow hunting season, youth season, musket season, the black powder season, all of them, all the deer harvested in Missouri are about 1/3 of that are taken during the 2 days of the opening weekend of November firearms deer season. So that's a lot of deer that are taken then. So as a result, it's just the best way to use our time. It makes the most efficient use of our time. If that's when the most deer are coming in, that's when we should be doing what in years past has been mandatory testing, and this year it's voluntary.
So we mentioned that in years past, this has always been mandatory. Now it's voluntary. How did COVID-19 influence that decision? And, are you doing anything for social distancing?
Right. Okay. I'll back up a little bit and just start with the procedure. For the last 4 or 5 years, we've had in certain parts of the state that's been identified basically as a CWD hotspot because that's where positive has been found. In that area, there have been mandatory testing. The reason being, if there's been one positive found there, we want to see if there's other positives. And the formula we use, wherever the positive has been found, it's a 10-mile radius from that. So any county that touches that, that falls within that 10-mile radius lands within what had been the mandatory sampling. And what had been in years past, on the opening weekend, hunters in those counties, in that CWD testing zone, had to take their deer in to testing sites, which are again listed in the regulations book. We pulled samples, sent them off to a lab, took the hunter's information about where they killed the deer and what their contact information was. Then, if we got a positive result back from that, we contacted the hunters and talked to them a little bit more about where exactly they got the deer. And if there was a negative information or a negative test result, hunters could check and find that out. Well, the difference is this year, because of COVID, getting back to your question, we are making that opening weekend voluntary. Reason being, this is kind of a crowding situation. Hunters get out of their vehicles. We talk to them. We have maps there. They get over the maps with our staff where they harvested the deer. They're out, with our staff, talking to them, getting other information. Crowding in a COVID situation is not a good thing. So we've cut it down. Number one rule for the hunters is they're not going to get out of their vehicles. Number two, for it is voluntary. So we have cut our staff down too, because we don't want this is a health issue for our staff too. We don't want our staff to be overcrowded in areas. So this year, on the opening weekend of November firearm season, which is November 14th and 15th, that Saturday and Sunday, it will be voluntary to take your deer in to any one of the sampling sites that are listed in our deer reg book, the sample collection sites in our deer regulations book. There, they can pull a sample. Same procedure as in years past. The only difference is, like I said, this year it's voluntary. We're still looking for the diseases, but bringing this all back to your questions, COVID is about avoiding crowds, wearing face masks. So we're trying to get the samples in as less of a crowded situation as possible.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. More Ozarks Tonight coming up after the break.